This is the 2023 operating budget presentation. As a reminder, we've already passed the capital budget, which covers the larger items and major improvements. Now we're getting into the operating budget, which covers the ongoing operations of the city and provides services to residents on a day-to-day basis. Just a few highlights to start us off here. First of all, we did budget for continuity of services, and that's a challenge every year. I know that sounds pretty basic, but a lot of our available budgetary flexibility just goes to maintaining current programs and current services that our citizens expect and trying to keep everyone, obviously employed and continuing to receive a paycheck. We did have some pretty significant cost increases this year, and we'll get into those a little bit later on during the presentation. Luckily, our revenues also increased as well, which helped to offset some of those expense increases, a lot of which were really outside of our control. And here is the budget summary sheet, which gives a brief overview of the budget overall. Couple of things of note. One, you'll notice that general government has decreased a little bit. That's not unusual for a department to decrease from time to time, just based on certain trends with employee turnover or health insurance enrollment changes. The other unique occurrence that we had for this budget is there was a slight reorganization of the Community Development Department, and that department actually straddles two different categories between general government and public safety with inspection. So that reorganization did change things a little bit from that perspective. And that's not something that's arbitrary on our part. That's actually based on state standards as far as different functions and which categories they fall into. You'll also notice that according to this, capital improvements did decrease a little bit. I want to note that this is just for the general fund portion of capital improvements. So this is the portion of capital that's funded either with use of fund balance, which is unspent money from previous years, or through TIF repayments, which we've also had a lot of TIF repayments lately that have pushed that up as well over the last couple of years. But those trends are starting to reverse to an extent, so that's why you see that number decreasing a little bit. However, the overall capital budget has increased significantly from 2022 to 2023, mainly related to funding from the ARPA, American Rescue Plan Act funding. So it's a little deceiving to show that decrease there. It makes it look like our capital budget has decreased, which actually isn't the case. It's just that the portion of the capital budget that's funded by the general fund has decreased slightly. And one other item to note with the budget summary page is at the bottom you'll see that the overall city tax levy is increasing by 2.5%, which is true. We are only increasing the amount that we're collecting in property taxes by 2.5%. However, we do expect that will actually result in a 3.8% increase in the tax rate, and that's due to some unique factors that we talked about at September Finance related specifically to TIF districts and more of our value shifting into TIF districts. So that's why you're seeing that larger increase in terms of the effect on the actual taxpayer versus the amount of money that we're actually collecting and can use for city purposes, which would be for supporting the operating budget and for making debt service payments. Okay, moving on to the sources of available funds for the 2023 budget. The largest one is net new construction, a little bit over $340,000. in terms of the levy adjustment that we can make due to new construction. That net new construction percentage was 2.52%, and that's the growth in our overall tax base due solely to new construction, not including price appreciation or the values of properties within the city getting higher, which the 341,000 is about what we need. That's almost exactly what we needed to cover the annual wage increases for our employees, which need to go up every year. Also, we had a few increases in state aid, believe it or not. I want to stress that these results are not at all typical. If you'll remember last year, we actually had our state aid reduced sort of at the last minute of the budget process. But this year, actually have some good news for you. We have an increase of 128,000 in aid through the Expenditure Restraint program, and then also are experiencing an increase of 104,000 in transportation aid. A couple of other positives: we had a pretty significant increase in interest revenue, 125,000 additional dollars in interest revenue. I think, as we know, interest rates have definitely increased this year, so that's definitely helpful. Allows us to make some more money on the idle funds that we have and on the fund balance that we maintain to really help the operating budget. And then a few other impacts. We did have reduced election expenses of about $61,000, and that's because in 2023 there are only 2 spring elections. There aren't any fall elections. Basically, election expenses, they're either going up or down every year as we alternate between years with only 2 elections and years with 4 elections. So of course that'll be going back up in 2024. And then also we've experienced an increase in room tax revenue. The $60,000 increase is just in the general fund share. 30% of room tax collections go to the general fund. So certainly it's nice to see that recovery. That's bringing the program back up, relatively speaking, to where it was in 2019 before the pandemic. So definitely nice to see that recovery, and definitely helpful as we try to make a budget balance. And here's a brief history of our net new construction amounts that affect our levy limits over the past 6 years. You can see the 2.52%. Certainly it's not bad. We've definitely had years that were lower than that. We've also had years that were higher than that as well. So I'd say this is sort of an in-between year. It's not bad, but it's also not the best year that we've ever had. The other item that I want to note on this chart here is for these low years like 2021, where we had just a 1.19% increase. Those obviously are very difficult years, and oftentimes we rely on sort of one-time solutions. So for instance, in 2021, the solution that we had that year, because our costs go up by more than 1.2% a year. So the solution that we had was actually to reduce our health insurance premiums. And at the time, that was based on the data and the fact that our health insurance program was doing pretty well at that time. Obviously, it has changed since then. But I think we need to really think about the future here in terms of, okay, can we handle another year like that where your increase is only 1 point something, especially in the current environment given inflation? And if we can't, okay, well then what are some of the other solutions that we need to think about in the event that we do have a year where you have that gap in net new construction and you need to find other solutions? This is a list of the projects that we had that make up our net new construction number. As a reminder, so there's really a 2-year delay in terms of when the construction happens and when we actually see it impact the budget. So this would be new construction that occurred between January 1st, 2021 and December 31st, 2021. So basically everything that happened during calendar year 2021. We had about $58.9 million in new construction, and the biggest projects there were Delta Dental was pretty big at $28.3 million, and then also Northside Yard at $10.6 million. So I always like to provide this breakdown in every budget. I think it's good to know how these projects actually impact that net new construction figure and how they impact our overall budget. And this takes the data that we saw in the previous slide and puts it into a pie chart just to help visualize it a little bit better. As you can see, so Delta Dental, 47% of our new construction, Northside Yard, 18% of our new construction. And this is pretty typical that we rely on 1 or 2 really large projects every year to really make up the bulk of our net new construction, which of course creates the concern, okay, what happens if you have a year where you don't have 1 or 2 really large projects like this? The other thing that I'll note is all residential construction is 10% of our net new construction figure. So then the remaining 90% would all be commercial business type construction. And that's pretty typical as well. Our strong point as the city, at least over the last 10 years or so, has been in the growth of residential construction and large, very significant projects that increase our tax base very significantly. So getting into some of the details on the 2 state aid programs that increased. The first is the Expenditure Restraint program, and this is a state aid program that is designed to create an incentive for local units of government to keep the total general fund budget size from growing beyond a specific percentage. I would actually say this program is somewhat obsolete. We're obviously glad that it exists and that we get this aid revenue, but now with levy limits being much more restrictive than the Expenditure Restraint program, this is really a carryover from a former time when if the state thought that local government was spending too much money, they provided an actual incentive, a carrot, to keep your spending reasonable, which of course now with levy limits, they've taken more of the stick approach. But this program is still out there and actually still provides a fairly significant amount of state aid to us, just because we do stay within those expenditure restrictions and expenditure guidelines. And the way that this is calculated is it's actually based on the total amount of property taxes levied that are above $5 per $1,000 in fair market value. And so essentially it's a matching program where, you know, we collect the money in property taxes, and right now for that amount that's above $5, we get about 7% back through this program. One thing I do want to note is that the state has not added money to this program, so I don't really expect that it will continue to go up. But what happened basically is we grabbed a bigger share of the pie from other municipalities, and that is just based on how our property values have changed versus other municipalities, and also how our tax levy has changed versus other municipalities. So I want to say this isn't just something that was a random occurrence or by luck, although part of it may have been some factors outside of our control. But we've also made some pretty conscious decision making from a public policy standpoint to try to maximize the state aid through these programs. And one example is when we worked on our long-term capital planning and funding transportation, we actually did discuss this program and the fact that if we collected money for transportation through property taxes, that would have a positive impact for purposes of the expenditure restraint program. So I do want to point that out there that we have been strategic as far as the decisions that we've made to try to do what we can to maximize our state aid. And next up is General Transportation Aid. This is the other state aid program that is increasing for us for 2023. The program is basically a reimbursement for past transportation spending, and the calculation is based on a rolling 6-year average of transportation spending. So it's really important what year is coming out and what year is going into the average. That can definitely change your aid payment, and it certainly is having an impact for 2023 because a very low transportation spending year, which was 2015, that's a year that actually we didn't even do a street reconstruct project, so it was probably the lowest year that we've had in the past 10 or so years for transportation spending. Well, that year is falling out of the average now. So that is why that 6-year average is going up, and then that increases our transportation aid. So again, the state did not add any additional money to this program, so I don't think that this is something that we can count on from year to year. It's just that our share of the pie has increased for 2023 just based on how the average changed and how the math works with that. And now that we've talked about the sources of available funds for the 2023 budget and where it's coming from, now we can talk about the uses and what the money is planned to be spent on. And certainly, hearing the list of revenue increases, one might have assumed that, boy, we should really be able to do some things with the 2023 budget. And I would say, ordinarily, yeah, that would probably be the case just based on some of the revenue increases that we did have. Unfortunately, the bad news that I have for you is that we got hit pretty hard with cost increases, a lot of which we have very limited control over. And one of the biggest, as you can see, is a health insurance premium increase. That is costing us a little bit over $340,000 a year. So that's a big hit in terms of the additional cost for health insurance. And then another sort of one-off increase that we wouldn't necessarily have every single year would be the pension contribution rates did increase as well. All of our full-time employees are in the state pension plan, the Wisconsin Retirement System, known as WRS, and we pay a percentage of every employee's salary into that plan, and then the employees pay something as well, and that gets them the coverage in the pension system when they decide to retire. And those percentages are increasing for 2023. The general employees didn't really see a big increase in those rates. However, we did see a very significant increase in the police and fire contribution rates for the pension system. So that's going to cost us just under $90,000. And then the rest of these adjustments, we would expect to see every year in terms of an annual adjustment to the pay plan. This year it's 2.7%, which obviously isn't what we would like it to be. We know that inflation is obviously much more than that. However, it is just difficult given our levy limit constraints being limited to new construction only being 2.52%. It's really hard to have salaries grow by significantly more than what we're seeing in terms of increases in revenues. And then we also have the regular wage adjustments for police and fire. Those are both under union collective bargaining agreements. And then the other item that I wanted to point out is we are proposing a $1,000 increase to the Historical Society subsidy. Usually I wouldn't include amounts this small in the budget presentation if we're tweaking a line item by $1,000 or $2,000. However, I know that the topic of funding for outside organizations is something that the Finance Committee has definitely taken some time to discuss in the past and has showed some interest in. So I just did want to point that out there, that that is in the proposal and something to discuss. Exploring the health insurance premium increases a little bit deeper here to explain sort of why we're having this substantial of an increase. And I know that we've already discussed this as well over the past several months, but just some items here that I wanted to highlight once again. First of all, health insurance claims are running about 20% higher than last year. So obviously that's a pretty big hit. We hope that that trend will turn around in the future, but right now we are seeing some pretty significant pressure in terms of how our health insurance plan is performing. So the proposal is a 14% increase. It's not going to be a 14% increase on every single tier, partly because of the restructuring that we're doing as far as adding some other health plan tiers to add a plan for employee plus spouse or employee plus children. And I'd also note this is actually our first premium increase in 5 years. The last year that we had a premium increase was 2018. And further, there was actually a premium decrease in 2021, which at that point, at that time, the health plan was performing very well. It was continuing to accumulate a lot of savings. So we felt that we needed to bring the funding rates in line with what the plan was actually costing. And now that has reversed, so basically now we need to go up from there. Also, the initial recommendation was actually to increase premiums by 27%. That's the number that we started out with, which would have been completely insurmountable. That would truly be a budget busting number. So certainly bringing that down to 14%, even though 14% is still pretty high, it definitely is a lot better than what we were originally looking at. And one of the ways that we're able to bring that number down is changing the third-party administrator, which is the company that actually pays the claims for the plan and negotiates discounts. Changing that to a third-party administrator that has better discounts with Aspirus is definitely helpful, and that is really in response to some of the changes in the local healthcare marketplace. With Aspirus taking over Ascension, all of a sudden it became much more critical to find a third-party administrator that has really good discounts with that provider, since their market share, grew significantly really overnight with the acquisition. So we certainly hope that performance improves, but if not, we could be looking at more health insurance increases in the future. I don't know if we'll be able to go another 5 years without having any increase in premiums. It would be nice. I'm just not sure that that's going to happen. And it's something that we need to be aware of, because in many of the past budgets, we really haven't had to find money for health insurance premium increases. So if this is going to be a new trend, and if our health insurance costs are going to be going up in the future, certainly that is going to have an impact on future budgets. And diving a little bit deeper into the 2.7% cost of living adjustment, as you'll see, it does compare fairly well with previous years. However, what it does not compare well with at all, and I know we've already talked about this, is inflation. Certainly, it's well short of inflation, and I think that that's something that's a concern really across the board. I know it's a big concern of mine. I know the mayor and the department heads are also very concerned about it, concerned about trying to do the best that we can to keep up with inflation and to keep up with what else is going on in the local labor market. So I expect that that's going to continue to be a significant challenge given where we're at with levy limits and some of the restrictions that we have. But we have to do the best that we can. And one change that I want to highlight from earlier this year that I think was really important was recognizing that we weren't going to be able to do an increase for the 2023 budget that kept pace with inflation. An effort was made to say, what else can we do to be an employer of choice, to be a good place to work? And a big modification was made to the vacation and time off benefit. And I think that, sometimes that's kind of what you have to do if you realize, okay, we're not going to have as much money as we would like to have in order to do something. Then sometimes you have to get creative about what else can we do. So hopefully those things will help as well. And then one other item to note, so for 2023 then, the minimum hourly rate for full-time employees starting out would be $21.02. And now for everyone's favorite part, the tax rate. How are we going to pay for this? As we already discussed, the levy is going to be increasing by 2.5% in terms of the total amount of tax dollars that we're going to collect citywide from properties. However, the actual tax rate will increase by about 3.8%. So for 2023, you're looking at an assessed tax rate of $11.27. I realize that does probably sound pretty high, but part of the reason why we're in that $11 range now is because we are probably overdue for a revaluation, which is currently underway. Once that revaluation happens, then for next year, I would expect that the assessed tax rate would go down pretty substantially. Also, if you look at this column on the right-hand side here, this is what we call the equalized tax rate. This is the rate based on the actual fair market value of the properties. And you can see because actually property values have appreciated pretty significantly from last year to this year, that would actually be going down to $8.52. Now, of course, the amount of taxes that people are going to pay aren't actually going down. It's just that their property values are appreciating right now faster than their tax bill would be increasing. So that's why you would see that decrease there. You can see if you look at things on an equalized fair market value basis, you can see that our tax rate actually is fairly stable. So to sum it all up, we're looking at a levy of $19,163,440, and like we said, the assessed tax rate of $11.27 per thousand. That is still a projection at this point. So now that we've covered the 2023 operating budget in detail, wanted to finish things off by looking to the future a little bit, looking to 2024 and beyond. I think it's always important that we're not just looking at the current budget cycle, but we're also looking toward the future. What do we see coming down the road that we're going to have to deal with? What are our future challenges? And the way that I'd like to start off this conversation is actually with an analogy. I know sometimes people like to make fun of me for my analogies, which is okay. I think that sometimes an analogy can be a good way to understand something, and especially since finance can be kind of complicated and boring, sometimes I like to use an analogy to sort of drive home a specific point. So in this analogy, we're going to use Star Trek. And you might think, well, what the heck does Star Trek have to do with the city budget? Well, just bear with me for a minute here. So in this example, basically you've got the Starship Enterprise, and as you can see here, it's actually taking a hit, and its shields are absorbing that hit. So it's probably in some kind of a battle. And you know, the good thing about having these shields is that it protects the actual ship itself from having any structural damage or suffering any harm. However, the important thing to note is that the ability of your shields to do that is not infinite. And eventually you run out of shields, and when that happens, then you do start to see that damage to the ship itself. So how does that relate to the city budget? Well, in the past, you know, when we've had budgetary hits, we've worked to find solutions to absorb those hits without really impacting the operations. So as an example, last year we had some difficult budgetary challenges. We were able to figure out a way to move some expenses in the operating budget to the capital budget. And that meant that, you know, we didn't really suffer any impacts to the city's operations. We didn't have to lay anyone off or get rid of any programs. However, that solution that we used, now, you know, we've used that's gone as a potential solution. In years past, we've also reduced self-funded insurance premiums, which to an extent, that's sort of the nice thing about being self-funded, is that you do have some ability to determine your own premiums. And in 2021, like we mentioned, we reduced our health insurance premiums to make up for the fact that we had a very low net new construction number that year. Last year, for the 2022 budget, we were able to reduce our self-insured work comp premiums, which definitely helped us get that budget balanced. And then we've also budgeted revenues more aggressively and expenditures less cautiously, as we've needed to, as things have gotten tighter with the budget. But, you know, much like the analogy with Star Trek and the shields, we don't have an infinite number of solutions to kind of keep things going, and especially with now being more than 10 years out with very restrictive levy limits, we're just running out of those solutions that we can grab to basically act like shields and absorb those impacts. So this brings me to actually looking forward to the 2024 budget. Now this is pretty preliminary because the net new construction number for the 2024 budget will be based on what's actually built during calendar year 2022, which of course is not over yet. However, just looking at the list of projects, we definitely have some things going on. We have exciting things happening in the city, but unfortunately what I'm not able to come up with is how those projects get us to the $60 million that we need in net new construction annually. And say it's short of that, say if it's only, you know, $30 million in net new construction, well, now you're looking at an adjustment of maybe 1.25%. In this inflationary environment, you know, I think we know that 1.25% or 1.5% is not going to cut it. And then in addition, for 2024, we also have the increase in expenses with elections because that's a presidential election year. Basically, election expenses are always either going down or going up, and for 2024, they'll be going up. So rather than seeing that decrease of the 60,000, well, now that flips to an increase of about 60,000. The total impact there is about $120,000. So we need to start thinking about some options, you know, even though this is a ways away, especially because the only elections are in the spring. So if we want to do a referendum for the 2024 budget, realistically, you're probably looking at a spring of 2023 referendum. which actually wouldn't be that far away. And I think that that's a discussion that we need to start having, not just for the 2024 budget, but for other future years as well, where if we have a year with a lower net new construction number, I think it is difficult to just continue to absorb that within the overall budget. Like I said, we are running out of those solutions. So it's maybe a little bit of a difficult conversation, but I think it's a conversation that we need to have. And I think what it comes down to is, we need to get our constituents and our residents of the city to understand that, we're not looking for a huge amount of additional funding here necessarily, but if our net new construction number is only 1.25 or 1.5, that's not very reasonable, and we'd really need 2.5 or 3 just to maintain the city operations and keep everything going. So with that, that concludes the budget presentation. If anyone does have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Just send me an email.